Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history from the Appalachian Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. November 17, 1927. The weather had turned bitter cold in Harlan County, Kentucky. Frost clung to the windows of every home in the mining town of Millerton, a place that existed solely because of the coal seam that ran beneath the surrounding mountains. It was here that the first reports emerged concerning the peculiar behavior of Veronica Burke, a woman whose name would eventually be recorded in local archives as the subject of one of the most disturbing investigations ever conducted in the Appalachian region. Veronica Burke was not native to Millerton. She had arrived from Richmond, Virginia in the spring of 1926 following the death of her husband, Augustus Burke, a wealthy businessman whose fortune had allowed her to purchase the largest house in town, a Victorian structure that sat atop Whistler's Hill, overlooking the entire mining community. The house had previously belonged to the mining company's superintendent, who had departed following the labor disputes that had turned violent the previous year. Local residents viewed the property with a mixture of admiration and suspicion, as it stood as a symbol of the economic divide that existed in Millerton between those who profited from the coal and those who risked their lives to extract it. What made Veronica's arrival particularly notable was that she came alone, no family, no staff, just herself and several trunks of possessions. In those days, a woman of means traveling alone was unusual enough to spark conversation, but her beauty silenced most critics. At 39, Veronica possessed a striking appearance, raven hair worn in an elegant bob that framed a face with high cheekbones and piercing gray eyes. She dressed fashionably, a stark contrast to the practical clothing worn by the local women. The house on Whistler's Hill had fallen into disrepair during the months it stood empty. Veronica hired local men to restore it to its former glory, paying them generously, according to accounts recorded in the personal journal of Millerton's general store owner, Jasper Holbrook. "Mrs. Burke has been most generous with her late husband's money," he wrote. "The men she's hired have been able to pay their tabs, and then some. If only there were more like her willing to spread their wealth in these difficult times." For several months, Veronica Burke was the subject of curious speculation, but little else she kept to herself, rarely venturing into town except to visit the general store for supplies or to hire workers for various projects around her property. Some found her aloof, others described her as merely reserved. The women of the town, according to local newspaper accounts, viewed her with a mixture of envy and suspicion. Everything changed in October 1927, when Millerton's mining operation reduced wages for the third time that year. Men who had barely been making ends meet suddenly found themselves unable to feed their families. Many abandoned the town entirely, seeking employment elsewhere. Those who remained grew increasingly desperate. It was during this period of economic distress that Veronica Burke began to exhibit the behavior that would eventually make her notorious. According to multiple accounts, she began to invite select men from the town to her home on Whistler's Hill. The invitations were delivered personally, often when the men's wives were occupied elsewhere. The first to receive such an invitation was Matthias Gantry, a foreman at the mine who had recently lost his position due to the cutbacks. His wife, Esther Gantry, later provided testimony to the investigators from the county sheriff's office. Matt came home that evening with a strange look in his eyes. He said Mrs. Burke had invited him to dinner at her house to discuss a potential employment opportunity. I didn't like it. No proper woman invites a married man to dine alone. But we needed the money desperately. Matthias Gantry arrived at the house on Whistler's Hill at precisely 7 o'clock on October 12th. According to his own account, which was recorded in a letter discovered among his possessions after his disappearance, Veronica greeted him wearing an evening gown that would have been more appropriate for a high society function in New York than a dinner in rural Kentucky. The house was transformed, he wrote. Candles everywhere, a table set with fine china, crystal glasses filled with wine. She smiled at me in a way no woman had smiled at me before, like she could see something in me that no one else could. She said she had been watching me, that she knew I was different from the others in town, more ambitious, more deserving. The dinner, according to Matthias's letter, was elaborate, several courses of food unlike anything available in Millerton. Veronica asked him detailed questions about his life, his aspirations, his frustrations. She listened attentively, refilling his wine glass whenever it emptied. As the evening progressed, she began to speak of her late husband and the fortune he had left her. She told me she was lonely, Matthias wrote, that the house was too big for just one person. She said she needed a man to help manage her affairs, someone she could trust. When I mentioned my wife, her expression changed for just a moment. Something cold passed behind her eyes, but then she smiled and said, arrangements could be made for Esther, too. There would be room for both of us if I proved myself worthy. What exactly transpired next remains unclear from Matthias's letter, as the final pages were damaged by what appeared to be water stains. What is known is that he returned home well after midnight, according to his wife's testimony, in a state of unusual excitement. He wouldn't tell me much about the evening, Esther later told investigators. Just that Mrs. Burke had offered him a position managing her household and investments. The pay was more than he'd ever made at the mine. When I asked why she would trust him with such responsibility when she barely knew him, he became defensive, said I should be grateful instead of suspicious. 3 days later, Matthias Gantry returned to the house on Whistler's Hill. According to Esther, he took his best suit and a small bag of personal items. He said Mrs. Burke needed him to help catalog some of her late husband's business holdings, that it might require him to stay overnight in the study. I didn't believe him, but what could I do? He said this was our chance to escape poverty. Matthias Gantry never returned to his home. When Esther went to the police a week later, they paid a visit to Veronica Burke's residence. She received them in the parlor, perfectly composed, and explained that, yes, she had hired Mr. Gantry for some business matters, but he had left several days prior, mentioning something about seeking better opportunities in Charleston. She expressed surprise that he hadn't informed his wife of his plans. The police, finding no evidence of foul play and aware of Veronica's social standing, accepted her explanation. Many men had left Millerton in recent months seeking work elsewhere, some without properly informing their families, out of shame or a desire for a fresh start. Over the next month, 3 more men from Millerton were invited to the house on Whistler's Hill. Samuel Warren, a carpenter who had done some repair work for Veronica, Tobias Fletcher, the town's only banker, and Donovan Pierce, a younger man who worked as a clerk in the mining company's office. All 3 disappeared after their second or third visit to Veronica's home. All 3 had told their families some variation of the same story, that Mrs. Burke had offered them employment managing her affairs. By mid-November, the town was abuzz with rumors. Some suggested the men had simply abandoned their families, seduced by Veronica's wealth and beauty. Others whispered darker theories, that she was somehow involved in their disappearances. When the sheriff finally decided to conduct a more thorough investigation, pressure from the mining company executives, who feared scandal might further destabilize the already precarious economic situation, resulted in the matter being handled quietly. 2 deputies were sent to search the house on Whistler's Hill, while Veronica was known to be in town. What they discovered in the attic was documented in official reports, but kept from the public for nearly 4 decades. Only when the county records were being transferred to microfilm in 1965 did a court clerk come across the sealed file and, disturbed by its contents, brought it to the attention of a local historian. According to the deputy's report, the attic of the house had been converted into what they described as a chamber unlike anything we have encountered in our years of service. The space was divided into sections by heavy curtains hanging from the rafters. The first section contained a table covered with journals, photographs, and personal effects belonging to each of the missing men. The journals were filled with entries that began normally but gradually became more disturbing. Matthias Gantry's final entry read, "She says I'm almost ready. That soon I'll understand what she saw in me from the beginning. The others don't matter anymore. Nothing matters but proving myself to her." Behind the next curtain, the deputies discovered what they described as instruments of restraint, handcuffs, ropes, and other devices attached to the support beams of the attic. Dark stains covered the wooden floor beneath them. The third section of the attic contained a collection of glass jars and bottles, carefully labeled and arranged on shelves built into the walls. The deputies did not detail the contents of these containers in their official report, noting only that they had immediately departed the premises to report their findings, and that the contents were of such a nature as to suggest severe mental disturbance and probable criminal activity. Before a proper investigation could be organized, a fire broke out at the house on Whistler's Hill. By the time the volunteer fire brigade arrived, the structure was engulfed in flames. The intense heat prevented any attempt to save the building or its contents. After the flames subsided, investigators combing through the ruins found no human remains. Veronica Burke had vanished. The official explanation given to the public was that the men had left town seeking employment and that Mrs. Burke, despondent over recent investment losses, had likely taken her own life in the fire. The case was considered closed. For the next several years, life in Millerton returned to a semblance of normalcy. The mine eventually closed during the economic collapse of 1929, and the town slowly emptied as families sought opportunities elsewhere. The story might have ended there, consigned to the dusty archives of forgotten county records, had it not been for a series of similar disappearances that began in a small mining community in West Virginia in 1934. Once again, men vanished after becoming acquainted with an elegant widow who had recently arrived in town. Once again, the widow disappeared before authorities could question her. And once again, the pattern repeated, this time in a textile mill town in North Carolina in 1937. In each location, the woman used a different name, but descriptions of her were strikingly similar: black hair, gray eyes, refined manners, and substantial wealth of unexplained origin. In each case, the disappearances ended when authorities began to investigate, and the woman vanished without a trace. The most disturbing connection between these cases emerged in 1938, when a doctor in Virginia was called to treat a drifter who had collapsed from exposure. Among the man's few possessions was a journal containing entries that matched the handwriting of Samuel Warren, one of the men who had disappeared from Millerton in 1927. The final pages described how he had escaped the attic after witnessing what happened to the others, but feared he would never truly be free of her influence. "She has ways of changing people," the journal read, "of opening doors inside your mind that should remain closed. I see her in my dreams still, standing at the foot of my bed, holding that silver key she always wore around her neck. She tells me I'm still hers, that the attic is wherever she is, and that one day I'll return to it willingly." The drifter died before he could be properly questioned, and the journal disappeared from the doctor's office the following night. The doctor reported the incident to local authorities, but without the journal as evidence. His account was dismissed as the ramblings of an overworked country physician. In the years that followed, reports surfaced across the Appalachian region of a woman matching Veronica Burke's description. She appeared in small communities during times of economic hardship, Always alone, always wealthy, always taking an interest in specific men who subsequently vanished. By 1945, these reports had become common enough that a federal investigator named Harrison Puit began collecting them, creating a file that traced a pattern of disappearances across 5 states. Pruitt's investigation led him to the microfilmed records of the original Millerton case in 1947. After reviewing the deputy's reports, he traveled to what remained of the town, by then little more than a collection of abandoned buildings being reclaimed by the forest. The foundation of the house on Whistler's Hill was still visible, though overgrown with weeds and saplings. According to Pruitt's notes, he spent several days excavating the ruins of the house's cellar. What he discovered there was documented in his personal journal rather than his official report, a decision he explained was due to the implausible nature of his findings, which would likely result in the termination of the investigation and possibly my career. Beneath the collapsed floor of the cellar, when he wrote, I discovered a second level that did not appear on any of the original house plans. The space contained a table, chair, and bookshelves, all remarkably preserved, despite the fire that had consumed the house above. The books were primarily medical texts, journals of psychological research, and several handwritten volumes in a language I could not identify. Brandy. Puit noted that among the artifacts he recovered was a small silver key on a chain, matching the description in Samuel Warren's journal. The key, according to his notes, opened a metal box found embedded in the wall of the hidden room. The contents of the box were described only as photographic evidence of procedures conducted in the attic, of such a disturbing nature that I have secured them separately. The federal investigation was officially closed in 1948, with a report stating only that there was insufficient evidence to establish federal crimes, and that the disappearances were likely the result of economic migration common during the period in question. Puit requested reassignment shortly thereafter and left government service entirely the following year. He died in a single-car accident in 1953, his vehicle inexplicably veering off a mountain road in western Virginia. The Veronica Burke case might have remained buried in obscurity had it not been for the discovery of Pruitt's personal effects by his nephew in 1968. Among them was a manuscript titled The Millerton Horror, a study in systematic corruption, which detailed not only his findings in the ruins of the house on Whistler's Hill, but also a theory about what had actually transpired there. According to Puit, Veronica Burke was not merely a predatory widow who had taken advantage of desperate men. His investigation had uncovered evidence suggesting she was conducting some form of psychological experimentation, using techniques that Puit believed she had learned from her late husband, who had allegedly been involved in experimental psychiatric research before his death. The attic, Puit wrote, served as both laboratory and theater. The men were not simply victims. They were transformed into willing participants through a process of psychological deconstruction and reconstruction. The journals recovered from the scene document this process from the subject's perspective, beginning with flattery and offers of financial security, progressing to isolation from previous social connections, followed by experiences designed to break down established patterns of thought and behavior. The most disturbing aspect of Pruitt's manuscript was his suggestion that Veronica Burke's disappearances were not escapes but relocations, that she deliberately changed her identity and location once she had gathered sufficient data from each group of subjects. He theorized that she was refining her techniques with each iteration, working toward some greater purpose that remained unclear from the available evidence. Even more troubling was his belief that she was not working alone. In each location, he wrote, Veronica Burke, or whatever her real name might be, established connections with local power structures, businessmen, law enforcement, government officials. These connections provided both protection for her activities and access to potential subjects. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidental. Pruitt's nephew, disturbed by the manuscript's contents, contacted a former colleague of his uncle's at the FBI. This led to a brief reopening of the investigation in 1969, but once again, official channels determined there was insufficient evidence to pursue the matter further. The manuscript was filed away, and the case returned to obscurity. In the decades that followed, occasional reports emerged from small communities throughout the Appalachian region, accounts of elegant, solitary women who arrived during periods of economic distress, purchased large homes, and took an interest in specific local men who subsequently disappeared. These reports were typically dismissed as urban legends inspired by the original Veronica Burke case, which had become something of a regional folktale. Then, in 1965, a graduate student named Margaret Thorne began researching what she called patterns of predation in economically depressed communities for her doctoral dissertation in sociology. Thorne had grown up in eastern Kentucky and had heard versions of the Veronica Burke story throughout her childhood. Initially skeptical, she approached the subject as an example of how economic anxiety manifests in regional folklore. As her research progressed, however, Thorne became convinced that there was more to the stories than mere legend. She traced police reports, newspaper accounts, and local histories across Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and North Carolina, documenting what appeared to be a consistent pattern of behavior spanning nearly 4 decades. What emerges, she wrote in her dissertation, is not a single predator, but a methodology, a system for identifying vulnerable communities and extracting something from them. Whether this represents the work of a single individual or a succession of imitators remains unclear. What is clear is that the pattern persisted too long and appeared in too many locations to be dismissed as coincidence or folklore. Thorne's research led her to a startling theory, that the various women identified as Veronica Burke over the years might not have been the same person physically, but rather individuals trained in the same techniques, pursuing the same objectives. She noted that descriptions of the women, while similar, contained subtle differences, suggesting different individuals adopting a similar persona rather than a single person aging naturally over time. Most disturbing was Thorne's discovery of what appeared to be a common symbol associated with each instance, a stylized drawing of a key that appeared in personal effects left behind, scratched into surfaces, or described in witness accounts. This key, similar to the silver one found by Puit in the ruins of the Millerton house, suggested what Thorne called a shared methodology or affiliation. In October 1968, as Thorne was completing her dissertation, she traveled to what remained of Millerton to examine the site of the original house on Whistler's Hill. According to the last entry in her research journal, she intended to conduct a more thorough excavation of the cellar where Puit had made his discoveries. She checked into a motel in the nearest town, 10 miles from the abandoned mining community, and was never seen again. Her abandoned car was discovered near the Millerton site 3 days later. A search of the area revealed no trace of Thorne herself. Her research materials, including her nearly completed dissertation, vanished along with her. The official investigation concluded that she had likely fallen into one of the many abandoned mine shafts in the area, her body unrecoverable due to flooding in the lower levels of the mines. Thorne's academic advisor, Dr. Victor Reynolds, was not satisfied with this explanation. He had read drafts of her dissertation and had become convinced that she had uncovered something significant. Using his own funds, he hired a private investigator to look into both Thorne's disappearance and the broader pattern she had identified. The investigator, a former police detective named Raymond Foster, spent 6 months following the trail Thorne had established. His final report to Reynolds, delivered in April 1969, has never been published in full, but excerpts have appeared in various academic papers on the case. "I have concluded," Foster wrote, that Dr. A. Thorne was correct in her assessment that the Veronica Burke incidents represent a systematic methodology rather than the actions of a single individual. Moreover, I believe this methodology has evolved over time, adapting to changing social conditions while maintaining its fundamental purpose. Foster's investigation revealed a disturbing possibility that the targets of these operations were not selected at random, but were chosen for specific psychological or physiological characteristics. In each case, he noted, the men who disappeared were described by their communities as exceptional in some way, unusually intelligent, talented, or possessing some unique skill or quality that set them apart. He also discovered that, in several cases, men who had been presumed to have abandoned their families or died had resurfaced years later in distant locations, employed in positions requiring specialized skills they had not previously possessed. These men, when interviewed, claimed no memory of the intervening years or of any encounter with a woman matching Veronica Burke's description. Medical examinations of two such individuals revealed unusual scarring on their scalps, hidden beneath their hair. The most alarming aspect of Foster's report was his suggestion that whatever had begun in Millerton in 1927 had not ended, but had instead evolved into something more sophisticated and more difficult to detect. The pattern becomes less visible over time, he wrote, not because the activity has ceased, but because it has become more refined. The modern manifestations would not be recognized as connected to the original case except by someone specifically looking for the pattern. Foster's investigation came to an abrupt end in September 1969 when he was found dead in his apartment, an apparent suicide. His notes and files from the case disappeared, leaving only the partial report he had already submitted to Reynolds. Once again, the investigation into the Veronica Burke case and its possible modern manifestations was abandoned. Reynolds himself became increasingly paranoid in the months following Foster's death. Colleagues reported that he began keeping unusual hours, securing his office with multiple locks, and expressing fear about being followed. In December 1969, he took an unexpected sabbatical from his university position and relocated to a remote cabin in the mountains of eastern Tennessee. From this isolated location, Reynolds continued to compile information on what he now called the Attic Protocol, his term for the methodology he believed had originated with Veronica Burke. He conducted interviews with relatives of men who had disappeared in similar circumstances, searched local archives for patterns of vanishings during economic downturns, and maintained correspondence with a small network of researchers who shared his interest in the case. In his final letter to a colleague, dated March 15, 1970, Reynolds wrote, "I am now convinced that what began in that attic in Millerton was never about the suffering or disappearance of individuals, but about what could be extracted from them under specific conditions of isolation and psychological pressure." The attic was not merely a place of confinement, but a specialized environment designed to access something within its occupants, something that could be harvested. Reynolds was never heard from again after sending this letter. When authorities finally checked his cabin in May 1970, they found it meticulously cleaned and organized, with no sign of struggle or forced entry. His research materials were gone, his files empty. The official report concluded that he had likely suffered a mental breakdown due to his obsession with the case and had abandoned his research. For nearly 2 decades after Reynolds's disappearance, the Veronica Burke case faded from even academic interest. Occasional articles in paranormal or true crime publications referenced it, but these typically sensationalized the more lurid aspects of the story without adding new information or insights. Then, in 1987, a journalist named Howard Mercer began researching a book on unsolved disappearances in the Appalachian region. Mercer had grown up in West Virginia and recalled hearing stories similar to the Veronica Burke case as a child. His initial interest was purely professional. He saw the potential for a compelling narrative that combined historical mystery with regional folklore. As his research progressed, however, Mercer became convinced that the pattern identified by Thorne and Reynolds was real and that it might still be ongoing. He traced what he believed were modern manifestations of the same methodology. Instances where economically vulnerable communities experienced clusters of disappearances preceded by the arrival of a solitary, affluent woman. Mercer's research led him to a remote community in western Virginia where, according to local rumors, several men had vanished over the previous 2 years after becoming associated with a recent arrival to the area, a widow who had purchased the largest house in the town, situated on a hill overlooking the community. Aware of what had happened to previous investigators, Mercer took precautions. He shared his research with multiple colleagues, arranged regular check-ins with his editor, and carried a concealed recording device during his visit to the Virginia community. None of these measures proved sufficient. 3 days after arriving in the town, Mercer disappeared. His rental car was found abandoned on a forest road outside the town. His hotel room showed no signs of disturbance, but his research materials were missing. The local sheriff conducted a search but found no trace of Mercer himself. The case was eventually classified as another unfortunate accident in the dangerous terrain of the Appalachian Mountains. 2 weeks after Mercer's disappearance, his editor received a package containing a single audio cassette. The recording, authenticated as Mercer's voice, contained just under 5 minutes of content. Most of it was obscured by static and background noise, but several phrases were clear enough to transcribe. Found the house. Hill, just like the others. She calls it something else, but it's the same. Asked about the attic. Her eyes changed when I mentioned it. There's a door in the back of the wardrobe. Leads to stairs. I can hear something moving above me. Going to investigate tonight. Key around her neck. Same symbol Thorne described. She knows I know. The recording ended with what sounded like footsteps approaching, a door opening, and Mercer greeting someone before the tape cut off. The FBI briefly investigated, but concluded there was insufficient evidence to establish that a federal crime had occurred. Once again, the case was closed. In the years since Mercer's disappearance, the Veronica Burke case has become a footnote in criminological literature, typically cited as an example of how economic distress can give rise to regional legends and conspiracy theories. Academic papers occasionally reference it in discussions of unsolved historical disappearances or the folklore of the Appalachian region. But serious investigation has largely ceased, and yet, in small communities throughout the Appalachian Mountains, stories persist, whispered accounts of elegant, solitary women who appeared during times of economic hardship, women who purchase large houses on hills overlooking struggling towns, women who take an interest in certain men who subsequently vanish. Most disturbing are the occasional reports of men who return after long absences, changed in ways their families can't quite articulate. Men who have no memory of where they've been or what happened to them. Men who sometimes wake screaming in the night about an attic and what happens there. The most recent documented case connected to this pattern occurred in a small coal mining community in eastern Kentucky in 1968, where 3 men disappeared over the course of 6 months, each after becoming acquainted with a recently arrived widow who had purchased the former mine manager's house on the outskirts of town. When investigators finally went to question her, they found the house empty, meticulously cleaned, with no trace of the woman or the missing men. In the decades since, no official investigations have been conducted, no federal resources allocated to determine whether these disparate cases might be connected by more than coincidence and folklore. The file on Veronica Burke and the disappearances from Millerton remains in the archives, occasionally referenced by true crime enthusiasts, but largely forgotten by law enforcement. Perhaps that is as it was intended to be. Perhaps the methodology that began in that attic in 1927 has evolved to the point where it no longer leaves traces visible to those not specifically looking for them. Perhaps it continues even now in communities made vulnerable by economic distress, in large houses on hills where attics contain secrets that few ever discover and fewer still survive to reveal. Or perhaps it is indeed merely legend, a story that evolves and spreads because it captures something true about the vulnerability of certain communities and the predators who might exploit that vulnerability. Perhaps Veronica Burke was simply a troubled woman who committed terrible acts in that house on Whistler's Hill, and all that followed was coincidence and folklore building upon the original horror. What remains undisputed is that 4 men disappeared from Millerton in the autumn of 1927, that a fire destroyed the house on Whistler's Hill before a proper investigation could be conducted, that Veronica Burke vanished without a trace, and that in the decades since, researchers who have delved too deeply into the case have themselves vanished, their work disappearing with them. The silver key that Puit discovered in the ruins of the Millerton house was logged into evidence at the Federal Building in Charleston, West Virginia, in 1947. According to inventory records, it remained there until 1969, when it was listed as missing, presumed lost, during archive reorganization. Its current whereabouts, like so much else connected to this case, remain unknown for those living in the Appalachian region, particularly in small communities dependent on fading industries. The legend serves as both warning and explanation, a way to understand the mysterious disappearances that occasionally occur in places where economic desperation makes people vulnerable to promises of opportunity and escape. And for those who have encountered the elegant women who sometimes appear in such communities, who have seen the silver key they wear around their necks, who have been invited to visit large houses on hills and shown the stairs that lead to attics. For them, the story of Veronica Burke is no legend at all, but a horror that continues to echo through the mountains, as real and as present as the darkness that settles over isolated valleys when the sun sinks behind the ridgelines. One aspect of the Millerton case that remains particularly disturbing is the nature of the relationship Veronica Burke established with each of the men who disappeared. According to the fragments of journals recovered from the attic, she did not employ simple seduction or financial enticement, but rather a complex methodology of psychological manipulation that transformed her victims from independent individuals into willing participants in whatever processes she conducted in that attic. Puit's manuscript contains excerpts from Matthias Gantry's journal that reveal the progression of this manipulation. At first, I believed she was merely lonely, in need of companionship and assistance. But now I understand that she saw something in me from the beginning, a potential that I myself did not recognize. She speaks of transformation, of becoming more than human, of transcending the limitations of the flesh. I thought these were merely philosophical musings, but now I have seen the evidence in her laboratory, the specimens, the documentation, the results. The reference to specimens and a laboratory suggests that Veronica Burke's activities in the attic went beyond psychological manipulation into some form of physiological experimentation. This aligns with Foster's discovery of unusual scarring on the scalps of men who reappeared years after their disappearances with no memory of the intervening time. What makes the Veronica Burke case particularly disturbing is not merely the disappearance of individuals or the suggestion of experimentation, but the implication that these activities were part of a larger organized effort that continued long after her disappearance from Millerton. The pattern of elegant, solitary women appearing in economically distressed communities, targeting specific men with particular qualities, and then vanishing when authorities began to investigate, suggests a systematic methodology rather than the actions of a single disturbed individual. The question that has haunted researchers of the case for decades is, what was the purpose of these activities? What was being harvested from the men in those attics? And who or what organization might be behind a pattern of behavior that has persisted, albeit in evolving forms, for over 4 decades? Reynolds's theory, outlined in his correspondence with colleagues before his disappearance, was that the Veronica Burke methodology represented an attempt to access and extract something that he referred to only as the hidden potential, capabilities or qualities that exist within certain individuals but remain dormant under normal circumstances. The attic, he wrote, creates conditions of isolation, disorientation, and psychological pressure that appear to activate dormant neural pathways. The process is described in the subject's journals as initially painful but eventually transformative. They speak of seeing beyond the veil, of understanding things that cannot be explained in ordinary language, of becoming more than they were. This theory might explain why the men who disappeared were often described by their communities as possessing unusual qualities or talents. They were not selected at random, but because they exhibited markers of the hidden potential that Veronica Burke and her possible associates sought to access and extract. It might also explain why some men reappeared years later, employed in positions requiring specialized skills they had not previously possessed, with no memory of the intervening time. They had been transformed through the attic protocol, their dormant capabilities activated and possibly harvested in some way before they were released back into society. The most disturbing possibility, suggested in Foster's report, is that the methodology that began in Millerton in 1927 represented not the aberrant behavior of a disturbed individual, but the first iterations of a systematic process that has been refined and expanded over the decades. That what appeared crude and horrific in that attic on Whistler's Hill has evolved into something more sophisticated, more difficult to detect, but no less devastating for those subjected to it. Foster noted that in the cases he investigated from the 1950s and 1960s, the physical evidence of restraint found in the original Millerton attic was absent. Instead, the men who disappeared appeared to have gone willingly, returning to the houses on hills night after night, becoming increasingly detached from their previous lives and connections. The methodology, he wrote, has evolved from physical restraint to psychological conditioning so effective that the subjects become willing participants in their own transformation. This evolution might explain why more recent manifestations of the pattern are harder to recognize and connect to the original case. The crude physical methods employed in Millerton have been replaced by more subtle psychological techniques, the obvious signs of experimentation supplanted by processes that leave fewer visible traces. But if Foster's theory is correct, the fundamental purpose remains the same: the identification, isolation, and transformation of individuals with specific qualities or potential for purposes that remain obscure, but that have been deemed valuable enough to justify decades of continued activity across multiple states. The silver key, which appears as a consistent element throughout the various cases, from the one found in the ruins of the Millerton house to the similar keys described as being worn by the women in later instances, suggests a shared methodology or affiliation. Thorne's research indicated that the key was not merely decorative, but symbolic, representing access to something hidden, something that could only be reached through specific methods and under specific conditions. The key, she wrote, appears repeatedly in the accounts of those who encountered these women, always described in similar terms: silver, ornate, worn on a chain around the neck. In some accounts, witnesses describe seeing the women touch the key while speaking to their targets, as if activating something through the gesture. The consistency of this detail across decades and geographical distances cannot be coincidental. What exactly the key symbolizes or activates remains unclear. Pruitt's manuscript suggested that it might be connected to the opening of doors referenced in the journals recovered from the Millerton attic. Not physical doors, but psychological ones, pathways to aspects of consciousness or capability that remain inaccessible under normal circumstances. Reynolds expanded on this theory in his correspondence, suggesting that the key represented not just access, but control, the ability to open and close these psychological doorways at will, to guide the subject through the process of transformation, and to contain or direct whatever emerges from that process. The most recent investigations into the pattern identified by Thorne and pursued by Reynolds, Foster, and Mercer have centered on the question of whether the methodology continues in the present day, and if so, what form it might now take. The economic landscape of the Appalachian region has changed significantly since 1927, but many communities still experience the kind of distress and vulnerability that characterized Millerton during the period when Veronica Burke arrived. Reports continue to emerge from such communities, accounts of solitary, affluent newcomers who purchased large homes on hills, who take an interest in specific local individuals, who maintain unusual privacy around their activities. These reports are typically dismissed by authorities as paranoia or the persistence of regional folklore, but for those familiar with the historical pattern, they represent disturbing evidence that what began in that attic in Millerton may still be unfolding. The most recent credible investigation into this ongoing pattern was conducted by a journalist named Alexandra Holt, who in 2003 began researching what she called extraction methodologies in vulnerable populations for a book on predatory behavior in economically depressed regions. Holt's research led her to the historical accounts of the Veronica Burke case and the subsequent investigations by Thorne, Reynolds, Foster, and Mercer. Unlike her predecessors, Holt approached the subject with extreme caution, aware of what had happened to previous investigators who had delved too deeply into the pattern. She conducted her research anonymously, using pseudonyms and intermediaries to gather information, and shared her findings only with a small group of trusted colleagues rather than publishing them openly. According to one of these colleagues, who spoke on condition of anonymity, Holt discovered evidence suggesting that the methodology had indeed continued to evolve and had become integrated into more conventional structures and institutions. She believed, the colleague stated, that what began as the isolated activities of individuals like Veronica Burke had over time been incorporated into something larger and more organized, that the attics were no longer in private homes on hills, but in facilities with more legitimate-appearing purposes. Holt's research led her to investigate a private research facility in Western Virginia, established in the 1990s as a behavioral health and cognitive sciences center. According to her notes, the facility was located in an economically depressed community and employed a staff that included several women who matched the general description associated with the historical pattern: elegant, solitary, with unexplained wealth and connections to influential figures in business and government. The facility's stated purpose was to study and treat various cognitive and psychological disorders, but Holt's investigation suggested that its actual activities might include identifying and recruiting individuals with specific qualities or potential, particularly from the surrounding economically vulnerable community. Before she could complete her investigation, Holt withdrew from public life, informing colleagues that she had accepted a position with a research institution overseas. Communications with her ceased abruptly in 2005, and attempts to locate her through the institution she had supposedly joined revealed that no such position had ever been offered or accepted. Her research materials, like those of the investigators before her, disappeared. Her colleagues, concerned about her sudden silence, contacted authorities, but the investigation concluded that she had likely chosen to sever previous connections and establish a new identity for personal reasons, a conclusion that those familiar with the pattern found disturbingly familiar. The facility that Holt had been investigating continued to operate for several years after her disappearance, but closed suddenly in 2009, citing funding issues. The building remains vacant, its purpose and activities during its operational period known only to those who worked within its walls. For the few researchers who continue to track the pattern identified by Thorne and pursued by Reynolds, Foster, Mercer, and Holt, the question remains: what began in that attic in Millerton in 1927, and what form does it take today? Has the methodology evolved to the point where it is no longer recognizable as connected to the original case? Has it been integrated into legitimate appearing institutions and structures, hiding in plain sight? Or has it indeed ended, the pattern broken, the methodology abandoned as its originators aged and died, leaving behind only the regional folklore and the persistent questions that have haunted the Appalachian Mountains for nearly a century? What remains certain is that the original Millerton case represents one of the most disturbing examples of predation on vulnerable communities in American history. That 4 men disappeared from that small mining town in the autumn of 1927 after becoming associated with Veronica Burke. That the house on Whistler's Hill contained an attic where something terrible occurred, and that those who have sought too earnestly to uncover the truth about what happened there have themselves disappeared, their research vanishing with them. For those who continue to study the case, the warning is clear: look too deeply into the attic, and you may find yourself within it. Ask too many questions about the silver key, and you may discover what doors it opens. Follow the pattern too closely, and you may become part of it. The attic waits, the key turns, and somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains, the methodology continues evolving, adapting but maintaining its essential nature: the identification, isolation, and transformation of those with the potential to become something more than they are, for purposes that remain as obscure and as disturbing as the dark corners of that original attic on Whistler's Hill. In the most recent development connected to the Veronica Burke case, a researcher at the University of Virginia discovered a collection of photographs in the archives of a psychiatric hospital that closed in the 1980s. The photographs, dating from the 1930s, show a woman bearing a striking resemblance to descriptions of Veronica Burke, standing alongside several men in white coats in what appears to be a clinical setting. The woman is wearing a silver key on a chain around her neck. The researcher who discovered the photographs shared them with colleagues interested in the history of psychiatric treatment in the Appalachian region. 3 days later, the researcher reported that the photographs had disappeared from the archive. When he attempted to access the digital copies he had made, he found the files corrupted beyond recovery. His requests to discuss the matter with university officials were denied, and he was informed that his research grant would not be renewed for the following academic year. The attic waits, the key turns, and somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains, a solitary woman with gray eyes is watching, selecting, inviting. The methodology continues. The pattern evolves, and those who see it too clearly become part of it, their voices silenced, their discoveries lost, their warnings unheeded, until someone somewhere finds the courage and the means to end what Veronica Burke began. To close the door to the attic and throw away the silver key that opens it, the disappearances will continue, the horror will persist, and the mountains will keep their darkest secret: what happens to those who climb the stairs to the attic and discover too late that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again.